Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's Monday, June 14th, or the 4th of Tammuz. We are studying the entire Talmud, one page at a time. Maybe we should amend it to one line at a time. And we're presently studying Masechet Shabbos, chapter 5. We're almost done with chapter 5. Probably tomorrow we'll have a siyum. And we are on 55b, that's Nun Hey Amud Beis. And we'll probably jump over onto Nun Vav Amud Aleph, which is the final Amud of this chapter. Just to point out that yesterday was Gimel Tammuz, the yahrzeit of the Rebbe. I had a short trip to New York to visit the kever. It's the first time since COVID broke out, and that's why we didn't have a shir yesterday. And I just want to repeat the last line that I said before we started recording, which is that we're talking about the Rebbe, and the Rebbe had so many areas that had he only had that one area, he would have been renowned for his greatness. Rebbe, of course, incorporated all of these things, and so many of us know the story, miracle stories, and that's of course what talks to us emotionally sometimes more than anything else. And so many people know the Rebbe as a miracle worker, and it's true. But the Rebbe was also a great Torah scholar, and there were many of the great Talmidei Chachamim of his age, not that long ago, 27 years since the yahrzeit. Since the passing, since Gimel Tammuz, and many of the great Talmidei Chachamim interacted with the Rebbe purely on a level of scholarship. And a good example is Rabbi Pinchas Hirschsprung, who was the chief rabbi of Montreal and a Welsh Talmud Chacham. He was the bochen. He was the person that would test to allow admittance into the yeshiva called Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, the yeshiva founded by Meir Shapiro for the most excellent students in the Polish Jewish world. And he was not initially a chassid of the Rebbe, but he was schlepped to a farbrengen or two. And when he encountered the Rebbe's Torah brilliance, he became a passionate and extreme chassid of the Rebbe, a great sacrifice to himself, because not everybody had shared his appreciation for the Rebbe, but he, just by virtue of the Rebbe's Torah scholarship, this great genius became an absolute chassid of the Rebbe. The Rebbe was also passionate about halacha in a very, very extreme and profound way. And this is evident in many, many ways, but it's also evident in the way the Rebbe would occasionally edit correspondences and work from his chassid, the shluchim. They'd send in, a flyer, and the Rebbe would many times make very nuanced and kind of, I don't want to use the word petty, but like very, very kind of thing that you or I might not pick up because it might create a halachic question. Or a question about halachic question, the Rebbe wanted that everything should be 1,000,000% in accordance to halacha. And so that's another thing that one might not pick up because we're so overwhelmed by the Torah and overwhelmed by the scholarship. And the Rebbe's Avas Yisrael, the Rebbe's love for every Jew is profound, and the Rebbe's sacrifice personally, and in the sense that the Rebbe didn't have a second of a break. The Rebbe pushed himself physically to the limit, to the point of great medical hardship, to share in law for every Jew. So it's Avas Yisrael. And Beryl, apparently I'm missing something because Beryl wants to add. But this is all the introduction. We're going to get to the Gemara shir. But
I just think it's worth mentioning that the Rebbe also, in some scientific texts sent to him, made comments that turned out to be correct.
The Rebbe was also a big gaon in science, as well as trained in the sciences. And the Rebbe corresponded greatly with people in that field. And so that's as well. And there was also apparently quite a mathematician, and there was a professor. There's a professor who was in Columbia for a while. I don't know about him. I don't know this person, but I heard recently from Rabbi Taub from previously of Buffalo and Alf Hollisburg that I guess one of his congregants' father was a very big professor in Columbia, and he became close to the Rebbe, and they shared birthdays. This is a fascinating thing, and he used to send the Rebbe a gift. And the Rebbe said, do me a favor. The gifts are not important. He understood that this was an absent-minded, brilliant professor. And the Rebbe felt that he's wasting his energy finding gifts. The Rebbe said, I'd much rather if you share with me a paper on a chiddush in math for our birthdays. And so he started sending every year a paper or something in a mathematic, problem or equation or something. And the Rebbe would write comments and notes. And I didn't know this, but Rabbi Taub said in the name of this professor that many of the Rebbe's harot, his comments ended up being published without his name in mathematical journals. So again, I heard this. I'd be curious to find out more. But Reb Errol, very, very good point. So, anyways, yesterday was his yard site. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people came to visit the kever, and many, many thousands more continue to be inspired by the Rebbe's legacy of Ahavas Yisrael, of love and being there for every Jew, and love for Eretz Yisrael and for Klal Yisrael. And certainly anyone that chooses to connect and follow the Rebbe, study the Rebbe's Torah, his teaching, certainly a big bracha. And one last thing, the Rebbe started in 1986 a campaign for people to study Rambam, the Rambam's work on halacha. And there were 3 tracks. I don't want to go through all of it now, but long story short, many, many people study 3 chapters of Rambam a day to become fluent with all the different areas of Jewish law. And the siyum, the conclusion of the very last chapter of Rambam, according to this track, concluded yesterday on Gimel Tammuz on the Rebbe's yard site for the 40th time. And so many, many Jews around the world today are opening up the Mishnah Torah to the very beginning, studying the introduction of the Rambam's work. And God willing, in a little under a year, they'll finish it again. And so another celebration, another wonderful thing that the Rebbe contributed to Klal Yisrael. But now let's jump into our very juicy, very interesting segment on the Gemara. So we're going to share the screen. And I just want to, yes.
Can I just tell you a short story about
go
what
for
happened?
it. Please, while I find the place, please go ahead.
There was one time a couple of years ago when Karen, my wife Karen, couldn't walk. She was paralyzed. Her legs were totally paralyzed.
Really?
And we took her to the emergency, and they didn't know what it was, and they were trying to figure it out, and did all kinds of tests, and they still couldn't figure it out. And she collapsed. They let her stand for 1 minute on her feet, and she collapsed and fell on the floor. Anyways, that was the weekend that I was supposed to go to the Rebbe, to the oil, with our group. And I finally went to the Rebbe, and I prayed for her.
Okay.
When I came back, she was perfect.
Wow. Wow. Rebbe Allen, thank you for sharing that. I'm happy that her health is restored. She continues to be so in good health. I've may have asked you and beyond. Thank you, Alan, for sharing that. Very special. All right, so now I'm going to remind everyone of what we're up to. I'm glad you interjected, and I'm glad you shared that. You made my day. So we've been talking about a variety of great, renowned people in the Tanakh, great tzaddikim, or some quasi-tzaddikim, or somewhat decent folks in the Tanakh that are described as having committed egregious sins. Now, sometimes the egregious sins portrayed are meant to be taken literally, because humans sin. Intentionally, unintentionally, we have big Yetzer Haras, and so it's not unnatural, it's not great from the Torah perspective, but it's very natural that human beings that are flawed are going to make mistakes and even do terrible things in the name of being humans, because that's the human condition. We do things we regret and are ashamed of and wish we hadn't, and that was true in the time of the Tanakh as well. However, there are certain instances that, based on a broad survey of how the Tanakh introduces the individual and certain testimonies that appear within the narrative describing those characters, that warrant a careful and deeper reading of the text to understand the context and what exactly happened. And so there are certain instances, like by Ruvain, where it says he slept with his stepmother, not stepmother. I guess today would be considered a stepmother, but his mother's co-wife, his father's wife. And the Torah says, based on the next line, it's clear that it's not literal, but it's meant to be an insight into how severely he was judged for something relatively minor by virtue of his righteousness and by virtue of the fact that he didn't see the way that everything that Yaakov did was informed by the Shekhinah, and therefore interfering there was egregious and a crime, and he's treated as if he'd done something very, very terrible, but in truth, he did not sin on that level, and had you or I done such a thing, it would be probably considered a mitzvah. We then were introduced to other types of people that maybe aren't ideally righteous. Reuben was a righteous tzaddik. someone who was willing to save his brother Yosef, who took from him all of the glory and honor, and Reuben was yet willing to go to bat to save his brother's life. And that's certainly evidence of a unique kind of person. Now, Beryl, I don't want to go now because we've already asked the question. We already punted on the question of how did the brothers come to sell Yosef. That is something that will be discussed in the course of our study through the Talmud. But that's the story of Reuben. Then we have the sons of Eli. Eli was the high priest. Eli was the high priest in the time of Shmuel, a great tzaddik and leader of the Jewish people. And the Tanakh, the book of Shmuel, is highly critical of Eli's sons. They did a lot of bad things. They took unwarranted gifts from the offerings. They interfered with people that are taking offerings. And they took more than they should have and earlier than they should have. And then the Torah says, yeah, they also slept with the women that were coming to the temple. And the Gemara says they were pretty not great folks. There's a lot to be critical about. But the Gemara's understanding based on the oral tradition is that they didn't literally lie with these women. What they did do is they interfered, just like with Yaakov, he interfered with his father's intimate life. Well, by making it complicated and difficult to have access to the temple, and by making it difficult and complicated for women that had given birth, and part of the childbirthing process, halachic process, I should say, that's portrayed in the parsha of Tazria, is that after a child is born, there's a certain purification process to give the mother a chance to rest and heal before intimacy resumes. It's a good idea anyways. And today, the OBGYN will suggest the same anyways. But in the time of the Torah, I think Jewish women probably had a greater chance to heal after giving birth than people around the globe. That's my suspicion. But they also had to bring an offering of gratitude to Hashem that came along with the purification and the end of the healing process. And by these two sons not making it easy, they may have been, or the Torah considers as if they interfered with the intimate life of these women and their spouses. And therefore, the Torah is incredibly critical. They weren't great folks either way, but this line, we're being told by the Gemara, based on our oral tradition and a deeper reading of the total context, is not to be taken literally. That's where we left off. But I just want to add, because I don't know if our Gemara adds. Okay, at the end of the sons of Eli, remind me to add one footnote that I think is very interesting. Gufa. So I don't know if you recall, but part of the evidence to say that they didn't literally lay with they didn't literally rape or seduce the women that were coming to the temple, which would be beyond over the pale and unacceptable. Again, not to say these things, such stories, by the way, are recounted in the Torah, and they are accepted as fact. This episode, for the preponderance of the textual evidence, the Gemara is saying it was not literal. Amarat. So now we're gonna quote the text that we mentioned earlier. There were two brothers, Pinchas and Chafni. Those are the Bnei Eli. Pinchas is a familiar Kohen name, right? The grandson of Aaron was also named Pinchas. So Pinchas lechata. Rav says Pinchas, the brother called Pinchas, never sinned. What is the evidence that he never really sinned? Shenemar. Ve'achia ben Achito ve'achi ikavod ben Pinchas ben Eli Kohen. So the Torah tells us the story of the heritage of another person, Achia, son of Achitov, who is the brother of Ikavod, and also the son of Pinchas. So Achia is the grandson of Pinchas. So here's the story. When the Torah wants to tell the story of an honorable person, a righteous person, and the Torah is trying to bring honor to them, and it gives us their lineage, it's a sign that lineage is considered prestigious and chashuv. And we have in general, there's a lot of comments in the Torah about when and why the Torah chooses to provide lineage. And every time that the Torah provides the lineage, it's to teach us something, either righteous or not righteous. And in this context, because we're talking about a righteous person, it's strange, or it's evident that this Pinchas wasn't the most terrible of people. And so Rav therefore says Pinchas was not a sinner. Let's read Rashi. Who is this Achia? V'shilo no se ephod. He was the person, I guess the high priest, who would wear the breastplate. The Torah is trying to honor him and tell us his illustrious heritage. And by mentioning Pinchas, instead of just saying he was a grandson of Eli, it tells us that this Pinchas wasn't as bad as the Torah seems to give him credit. Rashi, do you think in a text that's trying to honor him, we would mention his shameful grandfather? Lishvach, when it comes to a person that is intimate, that does adultery, the Torah says such a person is cut off. And the cutoff would be in two senses. First of all, they're not going to be being given honorable mention in the Tanakh. And also, it's quite likely or possible that the kids would not necessarily be afforded the opportunity to have this honorable position. Okay, anyways, long story short is that it's evident that the Tanakh does not believe that Pinchas literally committed adultery. I'm sorry, you see, Rashi is putting right. Farnemar, the verse says, Hashem should cut off the person that does acts such as adultery and the like. Him that is awake, Hashem will cut off. Who's going to cut off? The one who's awake and answers the tense of Yaakov, meaning the person that's acutely aware of what's happening on earth. Gemara gives another translation. If the person is a Yisrael, he will not find his descendants being sharp and part of the Torah process. And if the person is a Kohen, he'll not have a son who will be a Magish Mincha, who brings offerings because of his sins. Allah Shmamina, Pinchas, from here it's clear that Pinchas did not sin in a way that would literally warrant his being, what's the word? Being barred or disbarred, I should say, and his family being disbarred from the kahuna. Dr. Hammer.
Isn't there some principle of we're not responsible for the sins of our parents or grandparents?
We are not responsible for the sins of parents and grandparents.
So why when we're talking about this yichus brief stuff, all of a sudden it suggests the opposite?
So it's an interesting question. I'm going to give the answer that comes to mind with the comment that I'm sure there's more to it. But there are two kinds of consequences that a child could experience from the parents. There's a genetic or biological consequence. I'm using this by way of a parable. And then there is a spiritual and punishment kind of consequence. If a father does a sin, the son's not going to be punished. Hashem's not going to strike down a kid. If a father does a sin and the kid is a fine person, Hashem is not going to strike down that person, that child, with lightning. That's what it means, that children and parents are not going to suffer the consequences. But I'll tell you a personal anecdote just to personalize it. When I was in the hospital with my daughter Brachi when she was born, so we discovered a terrible thing. In the NICU, they have a dark room. And we were asking, what's that dark room? And they told us this is for the children born to addicts, cocaine addicts, I believe. And their eyes are sensitive to light. And they have to put them in dark rooms, and they actually have a drip line of, what do they give addicts to help them, to wean them off of, and these children are born addicted to the substance that their parents were taking and suffering. So there are sometimes consequences that are kind of biological consequences by the behavior of parents. And that is not a contradiction or a conflict with what it says that Hashem doesn't punish a child for the parent's sins, because this is not Hashem punishing a child for the parent's sins. This is the parent literally doing something to their body and thus to their baby. The same thing I think we can say has to do with lineage. There's certain honorable status or opportunities that are made available to certain lines of, family lines. And if a adult does something to break that line in their own life, they've broken themselves off of that chain, and it unfortunately carries on to their children. But I would see it more like a parent taking substance and during pregnancy than Hashem striking somebody down with lightning. I'd very much understand if someone doesn't like my explanation, but I hope it brings some. So basically, there's a distinction between a punishment and a a parent removing their family from a certain status or opportunity.
But Rabbi,
Dr. Rebuttal, go ahead.
it only carries on if you perpetuate it and you allow it to carry on and communicate it. So if you meet somebody and I tell you that his mechutin is a Rosh Yeshiva and a very honorable man in Yachenplatz, that does something to your evaluation of this individual. And if I tell you that the same relationship is sitting in prison because he was a drug dealer and many young children died because he was whatever, why is it necessary to share those tidbits of information about somebody's lineage if it's going to hurt them?
Oh, we're not talking about sharing hurtful lineage. We're only talking about the opposite. From the fact that we share his lineage, it seems to be evidence that there's nothing shameful, because we would not have looked to share shameful lineage. That's what we're saying. We're saying that we would not, this Pinchas is not as bad as the Torah is making him seem to be. How do we know this? Because the Torah considers him in a family tree as an item of covet. So it's not that we're saying his presence is a negative. His presence negates that negative. But you asked another question, which is why should, let me just reframe it one time and then we'll move on. Because I know we're not going to actually agree, but I want to, in Jewish law, the word's not agree. I know we're not going to be fully comfortable, because I'm not fully comfortable either, because it is a shame. And the most egregious instance is a mamzer. In Jewish law, a person that's born out of a problematic union might, depending on the circumstances, be classified as a mamzer. A mamzer, people tend to translate as a bastard, but it's not really. It's a much more technical and halachic term that under certain circumstances could apply. And it's the ultimate crime or shame that a child is suffering by virtue of something he never did. Now, how does the child suffer? He shouldn't be subjected to anything bad, but ultimately there are restrictions in who he can marry, and his lineage is less than ideal, to put it mildly. And why is a mamzer, why is the child being punished for something that he never could have possibly prevented, because he didn't exist in the moment of that union that brought him into this world? And that's really the prime instance where I would say that would be akin to the parents making a decision. Let's say not doing, today where you can do genetic testing, and so it's almost like a genetic. It's not genetic, but it's a biological reaction that happens by virtue of the union, but it's not a punishment. It's a consequence. And I think that's how we look at it. And I just want to add one more thing, because we're talking, the Gemara explicitly says, and we're going to learn it out in a few Masechtas, that we look at a person's achievement and accomplishment beyond their hereditary status. And so if you have a mamzer, a person that's probably from the most not great lineage to have, if they are Talmud Chacham, they achieve greatness in their lifetime, we'll abandon the Kohen Gadol to give honor and to learn from the mamzer. So it's not true that we don't value independent accomplishment. There are certain perks that come along with lineage, and a parent can occasionally do something to hurt that lineage. In the case of a mamzer, it's literally by having a forbidden union. And in the context of this verse, a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen that does certain terrible crimes would be disqualified either halachically or spiritually from continuing to have a line involved in the Kohen work. And from the fact that Pinchas is listed with honor, and the fact that his grandson was the Kohen Gadol, we're using as evidence to say he wasn't as terrible as one might assume based on reading the text in a literal sense, that they were raping or seducing married women. Reb Beryl, your comment, and then we're going to continue the Gemara.
Yeah, there's even a positive side to this, because if a parent realizes that something he might do would have consequences to his children and grandchildren, that's an argument for him to be careful about what he does.
Certainly. Again, it's a terrible tragedy, and I don't want to sound like we're being callous here. And I mean when we're talking about the children of a person that does something toxic or harmful for the child, and the child suffers. It's a terrible thing. This is not about being callous. It's simply that it's a consequence of
you have a consequence of a conversion. People
Yeah.
do
All
a
right.
conversion. All of a sudden, a grandchild wants to get married, and you
all right.
start.
Let's proceed with the Gemara. Before we go, no, this is very interesting. I love this conversation, but I want to get to the theme of the chapter. Maybe at the end we'll get back to this. So the Gemara says, hold on, you're telling me that Pinchas was a fine guy? Eli tells his sons, you guys, I'm getting a bad report. Who was giving him the report? Again, I'm not fresh in the book of Shmuel, but either people were coming with reports or maybe it was a prophecy. Amar Rab Nachman Bar Yitzchak Bini Ksiv. It does not say Banai, it says Bini, my son. And so maybe Pinchas was not so bad. Maybe Chafni was the real trouble. I believe that's what we're saying. Vaksiv Ma'avirim. It says, you guys, y'all's meaning two people. Amar Afuna Braid Rav Yeshua Ma'aviram Ksiv. No. It should be read that you, singular, are causing people to transgress. Again, in English, you and you could be plural and singular, but in Hebrew, grammar allows or provides two different ways to read the word if it's a plural or singular. And so again, right now our Gemara is in the midst of exploring Pinchas, Chafni, two brothers, both seem to be pretty not great. We brought testimony, the teaching of Rav indicating that Pinchas was a fine guy, evidence of his grandson who serves in the temple. And so we're now going through each detail and saying, no, it was one guy, it was a you, singular, not you, plural. Let's see Rashi real fast.
I apologize, I have to leave. Be well.
Beryl, thank you for being here for so long. We'll see you tomorrow. Kasha Ba'eni. Rashi says, is this Rashi? Hold on. Let me open my Gemara. I didn't even have my Gemara here open. Kasha Ba'eni. Hold on. All right, we're going to skip this Rashi for now because it's. Taisus points out that these comments of the Gemara, which are amending the Nikudot of the Tanakh, are not reflected in our Tanakh. So the Gemara says it's not Mavirim, it's Maviram. But I believe what Taisus is saying is Hashash Shalanu Chelik Al Sfarim Shalanu. The Talmud here appears to not be agreeing with our version of the Masoretic text. Shekasu behem Mavirim. V'chein Matzino b'Yerushalmi b'Shimshon who Shaved es Yisrael Arba'im Shana L'am Sheptish Menu Chav Shana Achar Moisei U'B'chol Sfarim Shana Kasav Chav Shana. So basically, Taisus is saying this is not the first time that the Gemara might propose a reading that's not entirely consistent with the actual reading of our text. What to make of it? If you don't mind, let's just let it hang for now. Let's let that big question hang. Maybe we'll put it on the list to revisit. We're not done yet. Hold on. You're telling me that these two boys are fine young boys? It says they're B'nai B'lial. B'nai B'lial is like one of the worst offenses, one of the worst insults, biblical insults you could give for somebody. B'lial. Again, I have a feeling in modern Hebrew there's some stronger phrases. If you want to say that you're really not happy with someone or you really don't think highly of them. But in biblical Hebrew, B'nai B'lial means like, well, here we translate it as scoundrels, but it means really the low of the low. Interesting. No, Chafni was the bad guy. Pinchas, not so bad. But tying it all back together. Pinchas, maybe he wasn't in on the crime, but he certainly didn't protest enough to stop his brother. And therefore, in a certain sense, the Torah is considering him as being part of the conspiracy. Now, note something interesting. On one hand, we're branding him as part of this problematic dynamic, even though obviously his slate of sin is much cleaner. And we all know how complicated and hard it is to mix into family. It's much easier to tell our friend or the person in the elevator they're doing something wrong. But when it's mishpach, it's so much more delicate. And it's so much more challenging, right? When and how and if, and he's not going to listen. And if he doesn't listen, it's going to cause tension, and then I will have even less ability to influence him in the future. There's so many reasons why families are complicated for real. I'm not saying, it's not only in our minds, but yet the Torah says this was such a not great, such an egregious situation, harassing women that are coming to and men that are coming to the Beis Hamikdash and taking from their stuff. He should have put his foot down, and he should have said, "Hey, brother, I'm here with you, and you're smearing my name." And as a matter of fact, if he would have said that, he would have been correct, because Pinchas is getting labeled B'nai Belial. He's one of the scoundrels or the sons of Belial. And this concludes our discussion about the sons of Eli. And Tosfos points out something that if he would have pointed out, one of you or I would have ended up bringing up, which is that apparently there are two opinions about how to view the sons of Eli. Because earlier on in the Gemara, we said that both of them sinned. Let me just go back real fast. The Gemara said as follows. I just want to feel a fast recap. Rabbi Yedison says, if you say that they sinned in the most egregious manner, you're making a mistake. And then he says, how do we know that it's a mistake? Because Pinchas didn't sin, and he uses the proof that Pinchas didn't sin. And then Rav says that Pinchas and Chafni were in the same boat, that they didn't sin. And therefore, really what happened wasn't so bad. Rav himself has a different view. He says Pinchas was the one that didn't sin, and Chafni did sin. What was the sin? I'm actually starting to think here that according to this interpretation, Rav's interpretation, that Pinchas was innocent and Chafni was not. Maybe Chafni actually did seduce or rape, depending on exactly how you read it, and his brother didn't. That's, I believe, what we're forced to say. So we have two opinions according to Tosfos anyways. And let me tell you what I'm thinking. And again, this is, I didn't dig deeply over here, so I want to just make that footnote. So if there's a correction, I'll welcome it. Maybe I'll make that correction if I dig here again. But I believe we have over here, according to Tosfos, is two opinions. Either they're both innocent of the most egregious sin, but they were abusive, or they did abuse their power a little bit when it came to seizing portions of the offerings. That's interpretation A. That's what Rabbi Elazar, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, right? No, that's what. No, I'm sorry. Shmuel bar Nachmani is quoting Rabbi Yonasan. If you say they're both innocent, it means they never seduced or raped or abused women, but they still weren't perfect. But relative to the great sin, they were perfect. Rav, however, seems to think that no, quite literally, Chafni was doing everything that he's accused of doing, but Pinchas was innocent. Two ways of understanding the Gemara, at least according to Tosfos. I'm certain that's not the end of the discussion, but that's what we have available at our fingertips. Give me a moment. Well, actually, no, let's open up the commentaries for a second. See if anybody comments here. So, but thus, we are concluding our Gemara's discussion about the sons of Eli. Now, what I wanted to add is that in the book of Shmuel, the sons of Eli ultimately are cursed. They are cursed. And there is actually a tradition brought elsewhere in the Gemara that the descendants of Eli lived short lifespans. Have you heard this? And actually, there are two famous rabbis in the Gemara who are recorded as having been descendants of the B'nai Eli, Pinchas and Chafni, I think Pinchas, and they actually are recorded in the Talmud as having both passed on at a relatively young age, and we actually read this already. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Abaya and Rava, famous debate partners in the Talmud, were both Kohanim, descendants of Eli, and they both passed on at a young age, and I believe it's connected to this curse of the descendants of Eli. I'm fairly certain, although I didn't look it up today, that we actually read this explicitly in the Gemara in Brachis, but I don't recall the citation. And so there was this family tradition that they would that family line had short lifespans, and so that's that. Now give me an opportunity to peek at what I wanted to look at. Yeah. All right, let's look at what Rabbi Steinsaltz writes over here in the notes. The exposition is puzzling. Remember I told you about Tosfos? Tosfos tells us that the Gemara seems to be disagreeing with our version of the Tanakh. This exposition is puzzling regarding the basis of biblical text and regarding its meaning. In the standard text of the Bible, the Torah is spelled with a yud, mavirim, which means plural. And for that reason, Rashi seems to want to delete this whole conversation. And actually, that was the long Rashi that I said, oh, let's skip it because it was just complicated. But Rabbi Steinsaltz does a good job. That's what Rashi's saying. Okay, you see? Look, see, maviram, kasha be'eni. It basically says we got to delete this. That's what Rabbi Steinsaltz explained. That sounds right. Tosfos noted that there are differences between the traditional biblical text of the sages and the standard text in use today. With regards to the homiletic interpretation, mavirim means to cause others to sin. If you cause only one other person to sin, it's not as bad as if you're causing others to sin. Anyways, so he points out that Rashi and Tosfos are actually disagreeing, and according to Rashi, he feels that this was a jarbled line that needs to be amended because of the implications that they had a wrong version of the Tanakh. We're now going to turn to page 56A. Just peeking one last time, see if there's anything else interesting to add over here. All right, so he quotes from the Maharsha here that the word Bnei Belial would indicate adultery. And so therefore, according to this reading, you'd have to say that at least one of the sons did do that. Being that Pinchas is recorded with honor, it sounds like that would be Chafni. All right, let's start the next Gemara. Another tragic story. We're the last line of 55a, turning to 56b. Amar Rabbi Shmuel, Bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan. Kol Omer, Bnei Shmuel chatu, eino elata. So who was Eli's prodigy student? Shmuel. Eli was a Kohen, happens to be. Shmuel is a Levi. Right? Shmuel's a Levi. Who was Shmuel's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, according to the Gemara and the Medrash? Anyone know who Shmuel's great-grandfather was? Someone? We got cool Levium on our chat. I'll tell you. According to tradition, Shmuel was a descendant of Korach. Korach's sons didn't die. They ended up surviving and having children. And one of the discussions about Korach, how did Korach, I believe it's in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and it's certainly in the Medrash on Parshas Korach as well, that Korach had a concept, a vision, that he's going to have great people descending from him. And he figured if great people are going to descend from me, then when I make my rebellion, I'll probably be victorious. And that was part of, according to this Medrashic interpretation, what encouraged Korach to begin his rebellion. He was correct. He had a great-great-great-great-grandson called Shmuel, one of the greatest Jewish leaders and tzaddikim of all times. He was the Navi, the prophet, who merited to begin the monarchy. Two kings, Shaul and David HaMelech, are both anointed by Shmuel. Korach wasn't wrong, but he was wrong. he thought that he can't be punished because someone great is going to come from him. He didn't realize that Korach was indeed punished. His family was indeed punished. But the sons of Korach who did teshuvah, they were saved, and it was their descendants. That is Shmuel. But now back to the story of Shmuel. The Tanakh seems to indicate that Shmuel's sons also weren't the biggest nachas in the universe. And so now we need to understand this story as well. So whoever says that the sons of Shmuel sinned, that's a mistake. Which sin do they do? So let's see. The verse says, Vayihi, ki zaken Shmuel uvanav leholchu b'drachav. When Shmuel became old or aged, his sons did not go in his ways. Simple reading. They didn't go in his ways. That would sound like they're doing bad stuff. Now let's take a look at the Tanakh for a moment just to see, fill in the blanks. When Shmuel got old, he appointed his sons to judge over Israel. This is the part that's not included in the Gemara, right? He had a son named Yoel. And the second one was Aviyah. And they were judges of the Jewish people in Beersheba. They did not follow their father. And they were impressed. They followed money. They became money hungry. They would accept bribes, and they messed with the justice system and subverted justice. And all the elders, or some of the elders, gathered and say, "Hey, Shmuel." Shmuel was still at Ramah, which was in, I believe, the Judean hills, somewhere not far from where the Jewish people landed originally in Israel, that area. And they said to him, "You're old, your sons are not quite like you. We need you to get us a decent replacement, and that's going to be a king." Shmuel didn't like the idea, and this is the story that ultimately leads to the monarchy. What's relevant for our Gemara is that it's pretty clear that they were not great. They did some pretty bad stuff. But comes Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani in the name of Rav Yonasan and says, no, they did not sin. What sin did they not do? Rashi says, they did not literally take bribery nor subvert justice. Well, if they didn't take bribes and subvert justice, why is the Torah saying they did? What is the Torah trying to tell us? So first, let's see this line. They didn't go in Shmuel's ways. They weren't quite as cool as their father Shmuel. They weren't as devoted, as wonderful as Shmuel. But it doesn't mean they sinned. Hold on, says the Gemara. What does it mean that they were money hungry? They lusted for money and they went after they did not act in the manner of their father. What was the manner of their father? The great tzaddik Shmuel would go all around Israel and judge them as needed in their cities. He was a roving, I think we might call this a circuit judge, right? Is it possible? Help me out. Were circuit judges originally meant to travel all around their district and judge? Yes. So that's why I think there are districts that are provided for circuit judges. So Shmuel acted as a circuit judge. He would travel around to all the cities of Israel and judge them. Shneimar, the verse confirms this. Every year he would go around. And he went to all the big important cities where the Jewish people were concentrated in those days, and he provided judgment. Vehemla also came, but his sons did not do so. Why did Shmuel stop? He was getting old. He wasn't up to it anymore. Remember, I started off today's discussion before I started recording, telling you that I'm getting old. I can no longer schlep all around. Well, everything is connected. Shmuel was feeling old, and he couldn't schlep around like that anymore. They chose to sit in one place. And by doing that, they helped the economic circumstances of their staff. How so? The Chazanim. This is a reference to the shamish, the people who are hired to serve those that needed to come in judgment, and the scribes were to write down all the documents. And by staying in one place, they made it economically advantageous for their staff. Because if you travel around, I believe the commentaries say when you travel around, there are travel expenses. You have to have airfare and hotels and meals. And apparently in those days, the work didn't cover all the travel expenses. And so if you had to travel for your job, you'd end up spending a lot of your income on work-related expenses. And so by staying in one place, he helped their economic circumstances. Let's see, the Maharsha. They didn't go in his way. It means they didn't follow his route on the circuit every year. They stayed in one place and they helped their staff. Here, the Maharsha, I just told this to you outside. When they have to travel around, their travel expenses might be even almost the same amount as their expenses. It's also possible that they would jack up the prices. They had the monopoly on the industry, and these people took advantage, and they would up the prices. And as we'll see soon, they also took fees beyond what they should have been taking. And because the staff did so, ultimately the buck stops with the boss. And so even if they didn't literally do these acts of accepting bribery and perverting justice, the Torah is holding them accountable for the misdeeds of their staff. Kitanoi, well, let's see. There is actually a machlokes among the rabbis of the Mishnah, otherwise known as Tanoim. The verse says, "Vayitu achrei abatza." They went after unfair, unjust gains. Rabbi Meir Omer chelkam shalu b'fiyam. Rabbi Meir says it means that they demanded whatever was due to a Levi. They demanded their portion of the tithe due to the Levites, abusing their position to the detriment of other Leviim. Imagine if you're this big macher, son of Shmuel, you could say, hey, I am the big macher, you got to give me my shares. And by the way, this is the exact opposite of a certain Levi that I know. We have a Levi in our shul, and he very frequently says, I don't want an aliyah, even though I could get it, give it to another Levi. So he acts very much the opposite of the Leviim here, who said, I know there are other Leviim, but you want us to look after you when you come to court? Hand it all over. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Milai hitilu al balei batim. They got into business with the locals. They got involved in business, and the problem is when you have business partners, it's going to be very hard to then judge them fairly. We'll see Rashi's elaboration. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Kupa Yisir Shal Maser Not L'Bezreh. They took extra tithes. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Matonis Not L'Bezreh. Rabbi Yossi says, and we'll see Rashi again, it seems like they were taking the presents that were warranted for the Kohanim. They took it for themselves. Or maybe I read this wrong, or we'll see Rashi, or at the very least, they demanded the Levite gifts, and the whole nature of the way it works with the tithes is that the owner gets the Tovat Hana'ah. The owner has the right to give it to whoever he would like, and the owner can leverage the social leverage. Right? You have a good friend, you'd rather give your friend your tithes, and that's okay, because the owner has the right to decide which Levi gets the tithes, which was, of course, an incentive for the Leviim to be all around likable guys. And being that their job was to teach the Jewish people, the better you were at your job, the better tips you got, or the better tithes you got. Let's see Rashi. Chelkam shal b'fiyam. Masa rishon aroy lahem. The tithes that they were meant to get, they demanded. Shalavim hayu shalu b'fiyam mitoich shayu g'day l'hador v'shoifim le'hoyu moinim mehem. And everyone else no one else wanted to step in because they were big machers. V'shar Leviim aniyim and starim. The other Leviim would never get their share, and they suffered because of it. So the Rabbi Meir lechatu b'atiyas mishpat. According to this interpretation, according to this opinion, they were not perverse in justice, but they did leverage their position. Another interpretation was that they got into business with the locals. Rashi noislam lehem pragmatia, or pragmatia. They got into business dealings They gave them where is lasikva, when their business partners were brought into justice, or maybe big vendors or buyers would end up getting some kind of leg up in court. Or they took more than they should have, or they took matanais. What are the matanais? So Rashi says, and I see I wasn't as wrong as Zeroya Lechayim V'Keva. There are certain portions of every animal that's slaughtered. The arm, the cheek, and other parts that are warranted to the kohen. Lishnachrina Matanis Levia Kagain Master. So either they took the kohen's gifts or they just forcefully took it, depending on how you interpret this Gemara. Obviously, interesting Hashkacha Pratis. That last Shabbos we read the Parsha Korach, who was the grandfather of Shmuel, as well as we read of the gifts that are due to the kohen and the gifts that are due to the Levi, and we see how everything is Bashkacha Pratis. All right, we're just going to tease the next segment, and then we're going to have to continue it tomorrow. This is the most famous, probably one of the most famous passages of the Talmud and one of the most famous discussions. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonis. Shmuel bar Nachmani quotes Rabbi Yonis to say as follows: Kol ha'omer David chata eino elator. He who presumes that David HaMelech committed a literal sin of marrying, of adultery, being with a married woman, that's a mistake. Rashi, what are we referring to? B'Basheva koden shekibla get. Whoever thinks that David HaMelech was intimate with the wife of, what was his name? Uriah. Basheva is making a mistake. Shenemar, Vayhi David l'chodrachav maskil Hashem imay. The verse says that David HaMelech, well, Hashem was with David in all of his ways. Hashem had him succeed, and Hashem was with him. The Torah attests that the Shekhinah was present with him if he had sinned. I know there's a lot of questions. We're going to discuss this tomorrow. It's going to be fun. Okay, we're going to do this bang together, but we're going to have to do it tomorrow after we finish this Gemara. All right, let's read a little more. Elomani Mekayim. If you're telling me that David HaMelech didn't sin by forcing another man's wife after seeing her and lusting for her, well, then there's a problem, because after that episode, Nasan HaNavi came to King David and was quite forcefully, and rebuked him quite forcefully. He asked him, Madua bozisas dvar Hashem lasis hara. Why did you shame or despise the word of Hashem to do evil? Doesn't that seem to indicate that he did something bad? So the Gemara says he actually didn't do anything bad, but he wanted to do something bad. We're going to stop right here. So what does it mean? We all know the story. We're going to explore the story tomorrow. We're going to see the Gemara's comment, and we're going to dig into some of the commentaries to understand what to do with this Gemara. Did David HaMelech sin? And was it to encourage all of us to do teshuvah? Or did David HaMelech somehow not sin? Or is it possible that his non-sinning was technical, but certainly not great? All the big questions we're going to explore Be'ezer Hashem with Hashem's help tomorrow. So please join us. Same time, same place, same link. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for sharing. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful, blessed day. We should see good health, and good circumstances, and good news for Klal Yisrael. And actually, let me just add, one of the depressing things about going to the Ohel is that, well, it's my choice. I invited people to share if they had any things that we needed to daven for, and so you always hear a lot of different circumstances of need and pain. So I just want to mention three names actually. We're going to daven. We'll dedicate retroactively our learning for Igor Basdora. This is an individual who has been in a coma for 6 months. Hashem should send her for Shlema. And we're also going to mention Sharon Ben Vera, a young man in the neighborhood. It doesn't come to shul yet. To Hashem, he'll be healed, and we'll make sure to bring him in. But he's also been, because of COVID, he's been in the hospital for several months now, and he needs a big miracle. And Hashem should send him a speedy, complete recovery. And we'll also mention Yosef and Flora for Chir Samiti, for good news, and for all of Klal Yisrael, good news, healthy news, happy news. Please join us tomorrow. A big Yasher Koyach to all.
Rabbi,
Yes.
it's Shalom Bear.
Shalom Ber Chumash today. Chumash is happy. Thank you, Doctor, for reminding me. I'm going to end the link in just a second, and Rabbi Shalom Ber will reactivate the link to study today's Chumash. I'm actually just going to change the name of the meeting. Hopefully, it'll reflect in the recording. All righty. See y'all tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.